Hey guys, I have a few quick thoughts to share on the Tyranids Faction Focus released today on Warhammer Community. Before we get started, my overall opinion on what we've seen of 10th thus far is it's overall looking much improved, though I do have some grievances. But onward with the Tyranids Faction Focus. Synapse at first glance seems butchered. You've gone from auto-passing a test to now having improved probability. It's inarguably worse. I don't know about you guys, but the prospect of passing an 8+ leadership test on units of Gantz using 3d6 instead of 2d6 doesn't leave me with confidence. That said, I gather the overall game design of 10th wants Battle Shock to be an ever-present mechanic, one they want players to deal with, unlike how morale typically resolves. And if Tyranids under Synapse have about the same rate of shock resistance as Marines, I think it's tasteful enough for the needs of the design. Being affected by the successor of the morale phase will just take some getting used to. Shadow in the Warp has shifted to a much greater degree, and I have mixed feelings on it. It is now a once per game ability to force the enemy army to take Battle Shock tests. And at first glance I was like, wow. A once per game ability that relies on my opponent rolling poorly. But, assuming scoring still takes place in the command phase, the threat of Shadows in the Warp means that the enemy player can't just rely on one single unit to sit on an objective. It's an ability which has the potential to impact scoring, which is potentially strong. And while we don't have the whole picture here to fully comprehend the NIDS toolkit, the Space Marines faction ability Oaths of Moment, an ability where you simply select an enemy unit to remove from existence, is certainly easier to appreciate. Though I'll say, the lack of interaction with enemy Psychers leaves me wanting, as I adore that narrative element of Shadow in the Warp. Gene Stealers seem fine enough. Swarmlord, regrettably, feels like a soft baby. Considering it is the Apex hyper-intelligent command organism the hive mind made manifest, he just feels a little limp. Tyranids are supposed to be good at melee. The prospect of being engaged in combat with a melee-dedicated Tyranid organism should be intimidating, something which should be dialed to its extreme against the Swarmlord. And with our comparison point to Rupture Cannon, praise be his name, the Swarmlord feels like a wet noodle. Come on, 8 attacks at strength 9, AP 2, 3 damage? What is this abstracting? Each arm makes 2 attacks? But Guilliman's single sword arm makes 14 attacks. Sure, his strength and damage are 1 pip worse, but he does have better AP and mortal wound potential. But you may be thinking the Bone Sabers are twin-linked, and having built-in rerolls isn't nothing. But in turn, Space Marines have access to army-wide rerolls, and Guilliman's Hand of Dominion will have 1 less attack than the twin-linked Bone Sabers, but it has enough strength to go into new Big Chungus Land Raiders wounding on 3s rather than 5s with rerolls. Never mind its better AP and damage and lethal hits ability, which lets hit rolls of 6 auto-wound. Now, I wouldn't expect the Swarmlord to be greater than a Primarch, but much like a Primarch, the Swarmlord is a life form spawned via complex bioengineering, plus a little bit of warp stuff. And so I expected it to have, for lack of a better term, big dick energy. And despite both units serving as the peak performance of each faction distilled into a single warrior on a 60mm base, there is a slight apples versus oranges element to the comparison. So we'll need to wait and see, as we're lacking context from the full suite of core and faction rules. What I really want to draw attention to is the newly previewed Rupture Cannon. Let us read. The Rupture Cannon's revolting payload gets even stronger in the new edition, to keep up with the tougher vehicles it'll encounter, and it can put out some seriously eye-watering damage numbers. I'll stop there. Calling the gun stronger, that it can put out eye-watering damage, is completely misleading. I will say the Rupture Cannon does have a greater strength characteristic than it had previously, but even with its old strength of 14, it would wound Big Chungus Land Raiders on 3s. Warhammer Community's claim is false.
Liar!
It's not a stronger weapon. It is in fact a much weaker one. Compared to the 9th edition iteration, its damage is in fact less eye-watering. While 2d6 tops out at 12 compared to d6 plus 4 topping out at 10, obviously the variance of this damage characteristic is far greater. going from an intimidating minimum damage of 5 to an undesirable potential of minimum 2, and it's lost in attack. In fact, the damage potential between the two versions of the Rupture Cannon is staggering. Here's a little comparative breakdown. It's a framing I use to evaluate weapon profiles looking at damage potential, where we assume the totality of a weapon's attacks make it through the attack sequence in order to deal damage. And so I ask you this. Based on the number of attacks, the relative strengths of both, which will wound Big Chungus T12 Land Raiders on 3s, which of these two is truly more eye-watering? Oh right, and the Endless Swarm stratagem seems pretty good. Gaining more sustain and the ability to regrow units to gain movement and latch onto objectives is always good.